11:47 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I have arrived a little late at the party when it comes to some of the investigative journalism being done in podcasts, but better late than never. And I've mentioned on a couple of occasions that we would try to bring your attention to some of the best, including, coincidentally, the work of a brilliant young journalist called Paul Caruana Galizia. What you may not know about Paul, who's been doing that work with regard to the Lebedevs and Russian oligarch infiltration of British society over at Reuters, is that he has an impeccable journalistic pedigree. His mother, Daphne, a Maltese journalist, was one of the most tireless chroniclers and enemies of political corruption in their home country, well, in anywhere in the world, actually, but she focused her work upon the Mediterranean island where she lived and worked, and her story culminated with her brutal assassination in 2017, an event that essentially blew the lid off a lot of the work she'd been doing with regard to corruption at the very highest of levels. If I tell you that even the Prime Minister resigned in the aftermath of that murder, you'll get an idea of just how deep and how far this corruption reached. And it is Daphne's death that has prompted Stephen Gray, the Reuters investigative journalist, to make a podcast called Who Killed Daphne? And it's drawing plaudits from all quarters. And Stephen joins me now. You promised when Daphne was killed, there were a few investigative journalists, weren't there, who made a pledge to keep her work alive.
That's right. It was very shocking. I didn't actually know Daphne personally, but I knew one of her other sons, Matthew, her eldest son, who was a friend. And when we heard that she died, we just realised that she'd been quite tirelessly, but also almost on her own, taking on corruption on this island. And then she was killed. And we just thought, we've got to keep her journalism alive. And we've got to show also that you can't get away with this. I had another friend, an Indian journalist called Gary Lankash, who's a very old friend of mine, was murdered as well a couple of weeks earlier, also for doing her work. And we thought, well, this is time to actually do something. So we got together a team of journalists, we called it the Daphne Project, to carry on her work. And this podcast sort of picks up the story, because the incredible thing is we were concentrating on carrying on her work on corruption. We didn't imagine that we would be able to do much about solving the crime itself of who killed Daphne. But as we tell, we realised that the police investigation was fundamentally corrupted, and we needed to do something. And the incredible thing was, without giving too much away, is that, you know, over the course of what's been 5 years almost, where I've been absolutely obsessed by this, we do identify the mastermind, or at least the alleged mastermind, because there's still trials going on, and it's been an incredible experience and an incredible story, and which is why I really wanted to share that in this podcast.
And we will get on to that revelation, that discovery that underpins the entire project shortly, but background first, Stephen. What sort of corruption was Daphne investigating? It's pertinent, I think, that there were 47 outstanding libel cases against her in the courts at the time of her death, and Malta is a country that still has an almost feudal makeup, I think, when it comes to the sort of pyramid of society and the people at the top of it.
It's a sort of place where, I mean, you'll recognise this elsewhere to a degree, but when you take power, when you become, when you're the Prime Minister or the ruling party, almost every decision from a planning permit to a police fine sort of depends on politics and who you know. And she was challenging that. And it's also a very male-dominated society, and she poked fun. She was funny, you know, she was witty as well. She had a sort of one-person blog. And she took everybody on. And she exposed how two ministers, senior figures, had companies in Panama through the Panama Papers that they hadn't disclosed. She was showing how they were selling off the country's passports, and there was a power station deal with bringing in money from remote places like Azerbaijan, huge scheme that was hard to explain, and she alleged there were kickbacks at the heart of that. So she was firing on multiple cylinders, and that was one of the problems we had is, where do we start? It was, I called it a rat's nest of corruption she described. But it's a story of impunity, and which you see in countless places as well, which I think that's why it's a sort of story that resonates, is, she became a victim because there was nobody investigating, taking on her allegations, and because it seemed like all the law enforcement authorities were sort of captured as well.
And I mean, you achieved. I mean, you got access to so many people who were involved. From Matthew, who was present at the time, he was at the scene of the murder, and the podcast.
It's heartrending.
Opens with his memories, doesn't it? With his descriptions of what happened.
It's terrible. I mean, he walked in bare feet, ran out of his house, and found his mother in bits. It's awful. And this podcast tells his story as well. It's the two of us really, the sort of parallel story of the journalist and Matthew himself kind of going to war for his mother's journalism and to keep her investigations alive and to help between us find the killers.
And that pursuit of the killers, that attempt to find the killers, as you've just alluded to, sort of proved unexpectedly successful, really, didn't it? I mean,
yeah. I mean, I should look. It's a gripping story. It still has not ended in that there are trials to happen. So we've got to be a little bit careful there.
Yes,
indeed. But yes. So we, in the course of it, we identify someone who turns out to be charged as the mastermind behind it all, a very rich person, and also to something that's never happened to me before. I managed to speak to one of those accused of planting the bomb, of detonating the bomb, and he
spoke to me
from jail, and he still officially denies it all. And to my surprise, he confesses on the tape.
We can hear that now, I think, can't we? So this is George DiGiorgio's first comment on the case, speaking to Stephen Gray about the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia.
Then one day, I got a message. It was from George DiGiorgio. One of Daphne's alleged murderers was reaching out to me. A few months later, I was speaking to him in prison. Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
What's the story?
Well, I'm still in Malta, still trying to work out what the truth is. I sent you a letter. Did you see that?
Yes, I see it.
Yeah? Can you say that there is more to come out?
Of course there is, yes. There is plenty to come out.
George told me he'd been looking to make a bargain, to get a plea deal like the other alleged hitman Vince Muscat. And you were prepared to testify?
Of course.
Yeah?
Of course.
And what would you ask in return? Do you need anything in return for that?
I mean, the other guy, he got 15 years. The other guy, yeah.
You want the same deal as he did?
The same or maybe less.
I ask him what he's prepared to testify. As he answers, I can scarcely believe what I'm hearing. This was a previous attempt to offer to kill Daphne.
Yes, and I've got deposit as well.
You got the deposit?
Yes.
Wow.
Everybody knows.
Everybody
knows.
DiGiorgio was claiming that he'd been hired to kill Daphne before. And he alleges the order came from a top Maltese political figure. He was saying there were, in fact, 2 contracts taken out to kill Daphne. And he says he met this person face to face.
He told me what he wants to do.
Right.
How much and shit like that,
He wanted Daphne killed.
Of course. That's why he wanted me. That's what we discussed.
Yeah.
I said send the deposit and we start.
DiGiorgio says he will name him to the police or a magistrate if he's called to testify. And what was he offering?
150 I asked him.
150? 150,000 euros. The same price as when the plot went ahead in 2017.
That's why I was the one to tell my brother 150, because I already was dealing before.
Yeah.
You understand?
Did you actually know Daphne? I mean, you know how big...
No.
You didn't know what a big...
If I knew, I would have gone for 10 million, not 150,000.
150,000. So you were surprised by the reaction?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
It's breathtaking, really, isn't it? So the idea that if he'd known what a big deal Daphne was...
And he goes on to chuckle. There's this laugh when he says, it was all just business. I'd expected him to sort of... He's saying... I mean, what a place. Someone had actually tried to kill Daphne before. There was a second attempt, is what he says. But then he confesses and says, he would have asked for 10 million if he knew what it...
And as you mentioned, the case is still ongoing. But I mean, it's just a remarkable position to find yourself in as a journalist. While your story is still unfolding, in some ways, he's provided an ending.
It's incredible. I've pretty long in the tooth. Been a journalist 30 years now. I've never actually found a killer confessing.
What happens next? I mean, the trial, most obviously, but do we know whether or not he is coming to an accommodation with the magistrate, whether or not he is going to be naming names, as it were?
There's a trial
including
coming
names
up.
that you know, but obviously can't say on the radio.
Yeah, he says that he will make a deal, and he will not let this trial go down, and he will not go down alone. There's still so much corruption there that hasn't been investigated. The family is still waiting for justice. But I think we've done a job, all of us, in showing that you can't just snuff someone out like this and expect the book to be closed.
Because they did expect that to happen. I think they did absolutely expect it to be the closing of a book.
They didn't know what they were taking on, and that we're not going to allow this to happen. And it is time. I hope it's a model for elsewhere, that when you see people do act alone, and there's lots of people writing blogs and doing their best, but we've got to show that you can't just using, whether it's lawsuits or the ultimate, you can't
silence
just
the truth.
You can't just silence it. Yeah.
Where can people... I mean, it's available in all the usual places, isn't it? Who Killed Daphne on Wondery, Apple, and all major podcast platforms. Very, very briefly, because it's a slightly odd question, and I have to go to the news. You mentioned how long in the tooth you are, Stephen Gray. Just a word on the power of podcasts as a journalistic tool, because it's hard to imagine, in the absence of a television commission or something like that, where you could have got the time and the space to undertake a project like this, say, 10 years ago.
No, absolutely. But I do think it's a great opportunity to get to share what we do. We spend months on these stories.
Yes.
And, we've spoken before about some of the investigations we did on, COVID. And, you write these articles, a few thousand words that represent weeks or sometimes months of work. And that's a certain audience that reads them. This opens up a whole different audience. So
Exactly.
I think it's wonderful. And you get to hear people. And I think when you actually listen to that last episode there and you hear his laugh, that tells its own story, and that's the power of audio.
Indeed it is. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen Gray. As I mentioned, Who Killed Daphne is available on all the major podcast platforms. The time now is 12 noon.